you for joining me once again on Garth's marvelous adventure. Garth is a man who stands for much and settles for everything. No doubt you have learned this. Today, be prepared for the impossible to grab hold of you and tickle you silly. I'm Brian Longshanks and you are listening to The Garth Brown Mysteries. The Garth Brown Mysteries, Book 3, Y. J.D. Yeats. Garth Brown sat cross-legged in his tub with his flabby arms outstretched. It had been days since he had had a good tuppence and it was beginning to affect him. He took a sip of the bath water and it didn't quite do it for him, but it was awful. He rose from the tub and put on his robe, but it fell to the ground around his ankles. He was flabbergasted, but continued on with his day. Why had Philostrato said that about poor Cuppins? Why indeed had he been looking out that window? He knew that their prisoner had some information that Garth Brown needed. He got into his 2002 automobile and as he was buckling up he realized he had no clothes on. He raced back into his room and put on his favorite top hat for the occasion and a very elegant belt. He returned to his vehicle and buzzed over to see Frizzy and their captive. "I am here, Frizzy. Let me in," insisted Garth as he banged on the front door of Frizzy's temple. "Ute 73. Yelled Frizzy. Garth giggled. Frizzy was speaking in the language that only they knew and he really liked it. 900 for Moog," replied Garth as he knocked down the door and ran inside. As Garth entered the temple he was astonished to see Philostrato tied to a chair with watermelons holding him down. There were darts injected into each of his nipples and balloons full of sulfur over his toes. "What is this buglery?" asked Garth. "I must speak to Philostrato and it must be professional." "I have been holding him for you. I thought this was how you liked your prisoners treated," said Frizzy. "I have never solved a case. We must take all precautions," said Garth as he loosened his suspenders. Garth walked over to Philostrato. He ran his two middle fingers over Philostrato and blew softly into the prisoner's eyes. "Now, Philostrato, the truth. Who are you working for?" inquired Garth. Philostrato spat on his own leg and responded, "ACH. Why don't you ask Cuppins?" "Ah yes. Prisoner very uncooperative," Garth said as he wrote a little note in his booklet. "Frizzy, I think we need the special treatment for this one." Garth gleamed with pleasureful longing. "Bar 3 oars 5. Yelled Frizzy. Garth immediately became twitchy, but passionate. With a firm grip Garth grabbed Frizzy by the shoulders and pulled him in close. "You don't mean we use the unforgivable technique?" Frizzy asked. "It is the only way," replied Garth. Just then Garth frantically removed all of his garments and stood there naked and wretched. "Now then," Garth spewed at Philostrato, "you will wish you had never seen this." "This isn't so bad," said Philostrato. "Not this. That," Garth said as he pointed at Frizzy Longbottom as he lurched from the back corner with his cranial lobe throbbing anxiously. Even Garth could hardly understand what he was seeing, for Frizzy had changed from the little man we all knew and loved into a voracious animal. His plastic claws were enough to frighten a goblin. "Now Philostrato, you will tell us the truth or I shall use my hands on you." Philostrato gurgled to himself and thought, "This is worse than death. I will tell you all I know. But it's just getting good." Garth responded, "Frizzy, please plunder this man." Like a jungle cat, Frizzy pronounced on Philostrato and started tearing out his hair. This made Garth very uncomfortable, but he was naked so he was in no place to intervene. "Please stop," yelled Philostrato, now completely bald and in tremendous pain. Frizzy halted the radical behavior and Garth expressed tenderness. Okay Philostrato, we've had our fun. Please tell us everything or I'll have Frizzy Longbottom eat your toenails off. Garth said tenderly. I was hired to send a message to Cuppins. He did something my bosses didn't like and I don't know anything else, Philostrato regurgitated. What did Cuppins do? Pressed Garth. I only know it had to do with the Tuppence recipe, insisted Philostrato. Who are your bosses and why are they so interested in a Tuppence recipe? Garth asked as he was becoming exceedingly amused. I swear I've told you all I know. Philostrato began but was interrupted as Frizzy shot him dead. Commendable. Now I must go talk to Cuppins, said Garth as he tiptoed out of the temple. Garth often liked to practice being sneaky. Chapter 2, Cuppins the Man of Interest. Garth Brown now knew that Cuppins' Tuppence recipe had attracted far more interest than in his own digestive tract. He had to go see Cuppins immediately. He opted not to get into his 2002 automobile this time and decided he preferred rather to put on his hairband and do lunges to get in his semi-annual exercises. He lunged towards Cuppins' quaint little home and as he approached the house with a grand smile on his kooky face, he saw that Cuppins was out front squatting down and weeding his daisy garden. Detective Garth Brown here. Garth Brown cried as he slowly approached the house doing his lunges and waving wildly at Cuppins. Just then, Garth tripped and face-planted into a large water puddle. I say, Garth. Are you all right? Cuppins said while running over to Garth. I'm afraid I've scraped my knee. Run and get me some soap, commanded Garth. While Cuppins ran to get Garth some soap for his knees, Garth moaned and groaned and counted to 905. Just as he reached the last number in his routine, he noticed a large butterfly that had the strangest wings he'd ever seen. Ain't that just the most wonderful thing? Garth thought to himself. Cuppins came running out and Garth quickly pretended to be unconscious. As Cuppins approached, Garth started moaning loudly. Cuppins dressed Garth's wounds tenderly and with great compassion like a mother goose and her ducklings. Garth hopped up to his feet, spry as ever he was, and asked Cuppins to join him for a walk in the garden. So Cuppins, I hear you've met a young lady, Garth began. Yes. Cuppins replied. Good. Garth said as he cleared his throat. Cuppins, you know our friendship has done wonders for my health both mentally and intrinsically. Garth began. Now I must ask you. What did Philostrato mean about the window when we arrested him? Oh that. Cuppins replied. I'd assumed that he was just trying to confuse you. But he didn't know how strong-willed and thick-headed you are. Thank you, Cuppins. That is all for now. Oh, perhaps one more thing. Do you have any idea why your Tuppence recipe has attracted so much interest? Cuppins removed his glasses and raised his eyebrows. My Tuppence are both inconvenient and powerful. Now close your mind, Garth. Please. Cuppins was interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. Immediately he rushed to the phone and said hello. My biscuits are ready? Said Cuppins nervously as he ran his hands down his thighs and scratched his knees. Just then Cuppins slammed the phone down and anxiously rushed out the door, leaving Garth in a state of utter bewilderment and frustration. Garth thought it was strange that Cuppins was so distressed over a simple pastry order. It was very unlike Cuppins to be late for anything. He was somewhat like a cat that way. Cuppins. I'm coming after you, Cuppins. Garth screamed as he ran out the door. He saw Cuppins sitting on the curb with his head under his knees and was crying. Garth started twitching with passion, and then he suddenly lost all mental capabilities, for he looked to his left and saw the strange butterfly again. He turned his body towards it and all the world seemed lost to him. He became completely unaware of his surroundings, for he was so entranced by the butterfly's body. He was unaware of Cuppins, unaware of his own name, unaware of the large van that came and the masked villains who grabbed Cuppins. In an instant, Garth regained his brain's cellular infrastructure and turned to see that Cuppins was nowhere to be found. Chapter 3, The Billowing Fountain. How on earth did I let my dear friend, Cuppins, get snatched away right in front of me? asked Garth to himself. Not knowing what else to do, Detective Garth Brown scrambled very elegantly to the Wizard Detective headquarters. With great abundance, Garth stormed through the front door and was alarmed to see the most heinous atrocity. There stood two detectives beating on a child. They were trying to take away the boy's rights and Garth did not want to get involved. As he passed, the two men spat at him. Garth Brown knew these two men, for they were his colleagues, Pompous Plum and Langus Munch. Pompous was a short, plump and unprincipled fellow. His repugnant eyeballs flashed and wobbled this way and that. Langus was a tall, fragile man with large teeth and no nose or eyebrows. His ankles were oversized and he had no toes. "I notice you smell horrendous," said Langus as he stuck his tongue out at Garth. Pompous laughed hysterically. "I have no time for your chaff," replied Garth as he frantically searched through files on his desk. He was looking to see if there were any similar kidnappings that had been reported. Garth found nothing and instantly felt the urge to eat a muffin and two evenly cut sausages. Along his way he noticed a large billowing fountain and he sat by it for a while, running his index finger through the small ripples of water. He continued trudging on to Keith's Eggs Incorporated for his breakfast. "Detective Garth Brown here. I will have a..." Garth lost his state of being for a mere moment, but in that moment he had seen his dear wife Sardine and that moment became an eternity. He became very hot and fragrant as he looked at her. Sardine was a very handsome but very dark-skinned albatross who towered over Garth. "Oh, how I love the Amazon," Garth thought to himself. He then approached the bar and ordered his meal, all the while looking at Sardine's bouldering hips. "Hoi Garth!" cried Keitha. "Here is your breakfast. Now what sort of cases have you been fiddling with lately?" "Oh Keitha, I don't know where to begin. Such a tonk of a journey it has been for me in my metal shoes," Garth responded. "Not that nasty bit about Cuppins and his recipe Hoi?" Keitha inquired. "Perhaps. How do you know of it?" Garth asked. "Oh, I've read it in the paper. You've become quite the London celebrity, Garth." Garth was tickled by this. He chippered right up and swooped back his hair behind his ears and tightened his suspenders. "Oh yes? I hadn't heard," Garth responded with a clear sense of pride in his tone. At that moment Sardine approached Garth. She raised her eyebrows and moaned softly. Garth felt his lower lip drop and could feel the saliva run down his chin. He realized that Sardine had been speaking to him for quite some time, but he knew not what she said or how long she had been speaking. "I love you, Sardine. I always have and I always will," insisted Garth. Sardine and Keitha both smiled and motioned for Garth to leave. This hurt Garth both emotionally and mystically. He felt every ligament in his body melt beneath his skin. He was so ashamed of his actions that he crumpled to the floor and scurried off. Chapter 4, The Rebarbative Majuscule. Days had gone by and Garth had not come up with any good ideas. He was sure to be fired because he had not solved the case yet and did not have one clue. Just then the phone rang. He picked it up. "Hello Mr. Spanks," wailed Garth. "There is no easy way to put this, Garth, but you have not come any closer to solving this case and I must release you of your duties," squealed Foster Spanks. "But what about the newspapers and my heroism?" retorted Garth. "That is all but your imagination, my boy. You have done no good. Now goodbye, Garth. You will be okay." Garth dropped the phone and could feel his voice box swell up and his eyelids ache. He scratched his bottom and collapsed to the floor. Garth lay motionless on the ground for days. He ate nothing but drank many tuppins. Tuppins and more tuppins. Gross homemade tuppins were all he ate. As the weeks went on, Garth could not help but feel he had let his country down. He had let his friend Cuppins down, but most of all he had let himself down. One lonely day in December, while Garth was sewing himself a pair of mittens, he heard a knock on the door. "Go away!" shouted Garth. "Whoso quant 67 tyke jolly flop," replied the man. Garth had been crying, But instantly his tears dried and his frown turned into a mighty grin that caused his cheeks to break softly, for it was Frizzy at the door speaking in the language that only they knew, and despite everything, Garth still really liked it. "Redeem malop gunky funky foblar blues necks," yelled Garth with his voice cracking up. Garth went to open the door and he saw Frizzy standing there with a flower pot with one daisy in it. This reminded Garth of cuppings and he fell to his knees and grabbed at Frizzy's ankles. "Oh Frizzy, gumpus pumpus labumia tromonolupthmosis," Garth cried. "Now, Garth. I know things seem clandestine. You have many oddities about you, but I have never met a man so untamed and resplendent as you are. Come, I want you to spit on the floor and spit out all your shame with it. You have a case to solve." Garth paused, looked to the floor, and spat. He felt a little better. "Wow, that a good," Frizzy said. "Now go, you are mosaic." Frizzy whisked away like a fairy godmother. Garth was left sitting in awe of himself. He had overcome diversity and now he had a case to solve. He suddenly began to wonder why Keitha had said he was such a hero in London when no one had ever approached him in the street or sent him roses. There was no time to waste. Garth thought a good place to start would be to go to Cindy Winter's residence. He raced over to the house in his ugly 2002 automobile. Garth unbuckled his buckle and combed his hair over his eyes. This was nice for him. He approached the door on his tiptoes. His sneaking practice had been working, for Garth noticed he had become a brilliant snoop. Garth Brown knocked on the door with the heel of his left foot. He waited for a moment but there was no answer. He looked up and saw a window on the second floor was open just slightly. Being a tall lanky snoop, Garth mustered up all of his might and jumped like a jungle cat. He reached out for the windowsill but his hands were too moist, for he had been sucking on them on the ride over. His hands slipped from the window and he fell to the ground, crashing into a baby statue. Garth rose from the ground and brushed off his knees. He decided the window was a bad idea and tried the door. It swung open. He entered the house and all seemed neat and tidy. Garth was amazed, for he thought women were very dirty. He walked into the kitchen and found a small note. It read, "It must be tonight." Garth was confused by the small note and smelled it. "Oh my flumpy scumpies," gasped Garth. Chapter 5, Garth's New Fetish. Garth Brown now knew some new details about the case that shocked him. He now knew everything. He decided to charge over to headquarters and tell Chief Spanks what he knew. As he was sprinting over to headquarters, he got clotheslined by a long arm that was blatantly obstructing his path. It was Langus Munch. "Ha! Garth. You miserable old diddly squat. Pompous and I have been placed in charge of the investigation and we are close to solving the case. Aforementioned Langus." "Oh?" Garth bawled. "The killer is Mantis plymouthus. He is at the bottom of the ocean and we have his precise location, but you are coming with us to be shark's food," said Pompous. "Wait, no," Garth said, but he was interrupted by his own thoughts. Before he could finish his inner thoughts, Langus Munch grabbed Garth by the ribcage and beat him like a fool. Garth woke up only a moment later to find himself strapped to a rocket submarine. He had seen this machine once before. He didn't like it. Garth's eyes ached and his lymph nodes quenched. He hadn't had a tuppence for days and he really was turned topsy-turvy. "Let me go," Garth yelled as he rubbed his belly button that had become a bit rotten and stinky. Pompous and Langus had become so full of themselves that they ignored Garth and set the rocket to launch into the ocean. The two men entered the rocket and pressed the big red button to launch. The rocket flew through the air and plunged into the water, and Pompous yelled for a big cupcake. The rocket plunged into the ocean and all was quiet. Garth looked about at the fishes and expressed friendliness towards this one sea turtle. It was wrinkly and perpetuated violence. Garth waved, the turtle winked, and thus the conversation began. "Booble blabla gumple wobba wobba boom patiety," said the sea turtle. Garth's jaw dropped and his bosoms ached for Frizzy's companionship. "Gee whiz. If only Frizzy could be here. The turtle speaks like one of us." Garth said. Bum 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 boozo ali flamamus to topupleton 309. Garth screamed at the turtle. The turtle nodded, and swam away. Suddenly, it charged back towards the submarine with tremendous speed and broke right through the window. Instantly, the sea turtle made its way to the front of the ship where Langus and Pompous were situated. With mighty bravery, the pulchritudinous sea turtle lunged at Langus. The lanky man pulled out his mighty sword and swung it at the sea turtle, but the tenacious turtle was much too quick. The turtle surged at Langus Munch and with one mighty gallop, he chomped his head right off. Pompous cried out in shock. Before Pompous Plum could sound the alarm, the sea turtle plunged right through the center of his body, killing him instantly. The turtle went into the control center and set the system to self-destruct in order to destroy the evidence, then returned to Garth. "Bobble in my tobble?" requested Garth. The turtle swooped under his legs and bit Garth's chains, and the turtle carried Garth back to the surface. The two became friends forever and always. Once at the surface, Garth jumped onto the dock and waved to the sea turtle. "Boobus lung oopus," Garth said thankfully. The turtle looked fondly at Garth and said vroom and beyond. Then the turtle disappeared into the ocean with his family. Garth stood on the dock and knew that this turtle was probably his equal. Chapter 6. Garth had no idea what had just happened to him, but he knew that he now had a new sea turtle companion, but most of all he had to solve the case. His mouth ached for a tuppence, but he knew Cuppins was gone and he could not have a tuppence, so his next best pleasure was to enjoy an evenly cut sausage as he gazed upon the beauty of sardine at Keith's Eggs Incorporated. Garth strolled over to the shop and walked inside. "Keitha," Garth said as he loosened his suspenders that were so very clamminess and wet, "do you by any chance make a good tuppence?" Garth asked. "Oh. Heavens no. A while back I got just the slimmest of tuppence on my lip and I went into a state of other illness. I was in a hospital for near a decade. The doctor said if I got even 1 ounce more, I'd have been dead." "Oh. Did you?" said Garth with a very suspicious tone to his voice. "Keitha, may you let Sardine take my order? She is my ex-wife and I love her dearly and I miss her voice." "Indeed you may. I know I was awfully dreadful in taking her away from you," said Keitha as he giggled like Satan. Just then, Sardine appeared from behind the kitchen. "What do you want, Garth?" asked Sardine. "I will have 2 evenly cut sausages and a muffin," said Garth. Sardine took out her notebook and wrote down the order. "May I keep that?" asked Garth as he chomped down on his lip so hard that his tooth went straight to the bone, splurting blood everywhere. Garth did not like seeing his own blood. Not at all. He puked 6 times. He only stopped puking after he saw blood. "Yes, for sure, Garth," replied Sardine. "I'm going to kiss you now," said Garth as he leaned towards Sardine. He pressed his lips against hers. Garth was shocked. "Thank you, Sardine." Garth quickly tucked his ears behind his head and leaned into Sardine's ear. "Your husband, Keitha, is the villain of this tale. I need you to bring him to Frizzy Longbottom's temple tomorrow evening at 6. Do not be late," said Garth as he licked the side of her cheek. Garth sprinted away. He went to a nearby phone booth and called Frizzy Longbottom. "Frizzy, I need you to do me a favor. I found a clue in Cindy's home and I have solved the case." Chapter 7, Case Actually Solved. Garth Brown awoke in his own bed the next morning and knew immediately that he had solved his first case. He leapt from his cushions and right into his slippers. He darted for the tub and bathed himself. Once he was proper cleaned up and ready to begin devising, he looked himself in the mirror. He had never looked so handsome. He made for his 2002 automobile and raced towards Frizzy's temple to make preparations. Soon, 6 p.m. came. Garth sat cross-legged in an armchair while he awaited for Frizzy to bring in all his guests. Frizzy appeared leading all the suspects into the room. First came Sardine and Keitha, then in came Big Chains, Pike Frost and all his flat breasts, Sheriff Googe, the boy from the shop, Foster Spanks, and Stinky Mike, and finally Eldersel. Garth pounced on Eldersel and kissed him passionately. Eldersel kicked Garth's ankle, then the two men parted. Garth stood in the center of the room and gazed upon all the guests. He could not help but enjoy every last minute of this performance. This was copectic for Garth. 1 year ago today I first entered Cuppins' Tuppence shop on Blythe Street. Back then I had no idea what I was walking into. Garth began. Cindy Winters was missing, and for many of you, Cindy was all but a dead girl in London. I journeyed through London and all across Europe to find the truth. Cuppins and I uncovered a conspiracy to steal his recipe for evil purposes, and we knew not what, but over time it presented itself. I had no idea why a recipe could attract so much attention, until I went to Cindy's house yesterday and found a note. This note was the key to solving the case. When I first read the note, I thought it had been Cuppins, but then I smelled it and knew this was not the case. Garth beckoned for Frizzy to enter the room. Frizzy entered dragging what seemed to be a large box behind him. He lifted the cover and it was a cage within which was held a woman. Cindy Winters was alive. Everyone gasped and Garth continued. I knew Cindy could not be dead. When I spoke to Keitha, he knew that I had been working on a case involving the Tuppence recipe. No one should have known these details about the case except me and the killer. Garth paused and pooped his pants. The sound was so loud that even Garth didn't like it. He continued while speaking even louder to cover up his childish behavior. So it is Keitha, yelled Pike Frost as he spanked himself. You might think that, said Garth as he pulled himself together. I sure thought that. And then I went to Cindy Winters' residence. There is where I found a note. At first I thought the note was from Cuppins, but then I smelt it. Even after I smelt it, I had a hunch, but I wasn't positive. I needed more evidence, Garth said with pleasure. Continuing, the primary question is, why was the Tuppence recipe so important? I realized why when I spoke to Keitha the other day about his Tuppence allergy. The note I had smelt in Cindy's residence was a familiar odor. Only one person stood to gain, both from Cindy's living body and the Tuppence recipe, a person who wanted to make love to Cindy and to have their husband out of the way. Garth grabbed his own nipples and twisted them so fiercely that he began to cry. The true villain, or villains I should say, are none other than my ex-lover, and Cindy Winters. The entire audience gasped in despair. Garth continued. This whole story started as a wholesome tale but became very satanic once Cindy and Sardine found love for one another. Once they found a passion for each other, they knew they had to get Keitha out of the way. They did not know how they would do this until Keitha had his deathly allergic reaction to Tuppence. After this, they had both a motive and a passion. They saw a path to deliver Tuppence to Keitha to kill him, and saw Cuppins as a prime suspect to accuse. Garth chocked over his own saliva and slapped his Adam's apple so hard that he nearly puked. Garth continued, Cuppins suspected that Cindy was up to no good, and right before he could bust her of her crimes, she went missing. This put the blame on Cuppins and sent me into a wild goose chase. Cuppins would have told me everything except for the fact that he and Keisha are also lovers. Sardine was threatening Cuppins with death to Keitha if he squealed the truth. How did you know Cuppins and Keitha were lovers? Asked the young boy. Why would Cuppins only give Keitha a small portion of his beloved Tuppence? Everyone loves Tuppence. Anyone I see eat Tuppence just swallows it without reason. When Cuppins gave Keitha his famous Tuppence, he only gave him a small portion. Only a lover would be so cautious. They would have left Cuppins alone if it hadn't been for me. I was too hot on the trail that the love Keitha and Cuppins shared for each other was not strong enough to keep Cuppins quiet, that Sardine and Cindy had to capture him. Garth pointed to Sardine. Sardine had Cindy Winters go missing to make Cuppins look guilty when really Sardine was the culprit. Both Cindy and Sardine were in on this terrible scheme. They were trying to use our dear Tuppence as a means to kill poor Keitha and frame Cuppins. You go hella pop? Asked Frizzy. Yes, Frizzy, I have solved my first case. Now take them away, said Detective Garth Brown. He had solved his first case. The next day Garth went to Tuppence to see how the grand opening of the new shop was going. "I, what a mighty adventure we have been on!" exclaimed Garth as he entered the shop. "Ah yes, a real tonk. Thanks again for rescuing me from the lion's den. I thought for sure Sardine and Cindy were going to eat me." The two men grasped each other's forearms and span in circles to the rhythm of the wind. They both laughed. They both were safe and happy. Thank you for joining me on this original Garth Brown quest. We now have a pretty good idea of what Garth is capable of now. I hope you will come again next time on Garth's Next Adventures. I'm Brian Longshanks and you have been listening to The Garth Brown Mysteries.